In this video, I will be making the very best possible arguments that Bob Lazar is indeed telling the truth, that he worked on back engineering non-human propulsion systems of vehicles from not of this world in a project called Galileo at a sub-base of Area 51 called S4, 15 to 17 miles south of Area 51 on a stretch of land called Papoose Lake. I will conduct this video as if I'm Bob Lazar's attorney. All right. UFO Jesus is about to destroy the prosecution. Would the defense please give their opening statement? Bob Lazar, eccentric, scientist extraordinaire. He's built rocket-powered cars, rocket-powered bikes. Hell, the man even had a particle accelerator in his master bedroom. Yeah, he's a bit of an eccentric, but UFO buff? Not at all. Never was. Quite frankly, the man does not read books about UFOs. He's never even been to a UFO conference. Well, actually, he did one UFO conference within the span of 30 years. And that was because it was the 25th anniversary of him coming forward with his story about working on non-human craft in an effort to back engineer the propulsion system. And he only attended because George Knapp twisted his arm to do so. But even then, he almost didn't attend, and Alejandro Rojas had to semi-threaten Bob Lazar and say, hey, bud, you signed the contract. You're going. And indeed, Bob Lazar did go to the conference, but reluctantly, nevertheless. Getting Bob Lazar to do a lecture or a UFO conference or a radio appearance is like trying to pull teeth from someone who has impeccable dental health. This is not a man who seeks attention or seeks accolades for his experience back in 1989 of working on propulsion system of an alien spacecraft. He does not yearn for attention. That has been well established. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, are you asking me to believe? Are you asking yourself to believe that Bob Lazar, a man who used to feel pity and bad for John Lear, because John Lear would tell Bob Lazar about his belief in UFOs. He felt bad for him because John Lear comes from a prominent family, the Learjet family. Are you asking me to believe? Are you asking yourself to believe that this is a man that would wake up one day and commit to a tall tale for the past 30 years, never adding any more details than what he originally said? This is not adding up, jury. This is a man who, if you go and look at his history, you interview people that knew him, family and friends, prior to 1989 when he worked at S4, you will not find one human being go on the record and say, oh yeah, Lazar, he was all up into the UFO subject. You will not find one. There is no record of this guy being interested in this. There is no record of this guy being interested in anything remotely like this, whether it's ghosts or Bigfoot or conspiracy theories. This was never his wheelhouse, isn't today by any stretch of the imagination. This is not the kind of person who has the personality profile that would give him the incentive, the motivation, and the commitment to continue a story like this for so many years. Furthermore, in 1989, he came to George Knapp of KLAS TV Las Vegas to go on the record on that news station and tell the world his experience working on alien spacecraft in 1989. Just prior to that tape going live, Bob Lazar wrestled to the ground with George Knapp. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, are you asking me, are you asking yourself to believe that this was some kind of stunt? That he had to emote tremendous fear? Oh geez, this is all going live. What's going to happen to me? Maybe someone's going to try to take my life because I'm going live on a news station about my experience and breaking my oath of secrecy. Imagine the acting that you would have to engage in to get George Knapp to the ground and vigorously try to take the tape away from him. Now, George Knapp's a bigger man, was able to overcome Bob Lazar's efforts. But this whole thing is just not adding up. I mean, if Bob Lazar is lying, then it's really bizarre how committed he's been to this lie for so long, and how everything seems to corroborate his lie, as if the stars align to make it look like he was telling the truth from the beginning. And we will go into all of that corroboration as this trial moves forward. But here's something I want you to think about as this trial moves forward. Did the stars align so that scenario after scenario after scenario after scenario after scenario makes it appear he's constantly telling the truth? Alternatively, is he telling the truth? When the moment of deliberation comes, I trust you will dig deep into your consciousness and you will do the right thing. Your Honor, Bob Lazar is telling the truth. To further solidify the reality that Bob Lazar is disinterested in the UFO subject for the most part, and to underscore the skeptical nature of his personality, I'm going to share with you a few excerpts from a November 25th, 2018 Coast to Coast AM interview with George Knapp, Jeremy Corbell, and of course Bob Lazar. It should be noted that this was the first radio interview he's done in 5 years. This is not a man that pursues attention whatsoever. Caller asks, you see some reports of UFOs and there are a lot of triangular UFOs and this and that. Does any of that stuff pique your interest as you see it? Lazar responds, it does. A lot of them do, but you just don't know. There are so many fabricated reports out there and distorted stories, it's so difficult to dig through and find out what's accurate and what's not. There are a few that have caught my interest. I can't remember their names. They are back in the 80s. I think they were triangular craft back in Bulgaria or something like that. I'm sure I have all this wrong, but I think it was really interesting. They were triangular, and at each apex there was a round area. It just made me think of the same layout in the craft, that everything was in threes, and it was that way in the other craft, so I wonder why is that such a magical number. In Bulgaria or something like that, Lazar doesn't even have a firm grasp of the Belgium UFO wave. His knowledge of ufology is not representative of someone who has any kind of particular interest in the subject. Here, Jeremy Corbell chimes in about his military contact. I have probably the highest ranking military individual that I have ever met for sure that has always talked to me about my work and has advised me, and he's told me what not to focus on to waste my time. When it came to Bob, and it came to Bob's story, and it came to Papoose, and it came to S4, he told me, now that is a story you should cover. That is a story that is worth your time. And that holds no weight for Bob. No weight at all. But you know who I'm talking about, George, and it holds weight for me. Now imagine the respected investigative filmmaker Jeremy Corbell relayed on the air on Coast to Coast AM that an extremely high-level military official conveyed to him that you really need to look into Corey Goode and Emery Smith because there's a lot of truth there. How do you imagine that Corey Goode and Emery Smith would respond to that? Contrast that to how Bob Lazar responds to it. Moreover, is Bob Lazar ever going to repeat that? Bob Lazar doesn't give a damn about that. The man is a skeptical person. Period. Will the defense please call their first witness? The defense calls George Knapp to the stand. George Knapp, please take the stand.
And thirdly, is that if it had only been Bob telling this story about things that have been going on at S4 and Area 51, chances are we would not have moved forward with the project. But the fact is that more than 24 people have come forward with bits and pieces of the same information. People who have worked at Area 51 in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s who have told me pretty much the same thing. People who have seen saucer-shaped craft out there in hangars, saucer-shaped craft flying in the desert, being transported. People who say that what goes on out there is trying to figure out how this technology works so that we construct it reconstruct it with Earth materials instead of building something that we came up with the idea for.
As you can see, George Knapp did not pursue this story on a lark. He's the recipient of Emmy Awards as well as Peabody Awards, and that's just not how Mr. Knapp operates. The reputation of Mr. Knapp, as well as the news entity he was working for, was at risk. One measure George Knapp took before moving forward with the Lazar story was to get a bunch of confirmed Area 51 employees in the room with Bob Lazar, employees that worked there at the time Bob Lazar said he worked there, and they all grilled him, asking him questions that you simply would be unable to know unless you flied through the Janet flights into Area 51. And at the end of his grilling, every single one of those employees that worked out at Area 51 believed that indeed Bob Lazar also frequented the installation. But George Knapp, being George Knapp, he didn't stop there. He put Bob Lazar through 4 different polygraph tests by a man named Terry Tabernetti, a former LA-based police officer turned professional polygrapher, who up until this very day does polygraph tests for casinos to vet employees for theft. Bob Lazar aced all 4 of those tests, and at the end, Mr. Tabernetti believed the testimony of Bob Lazar. So why did Bob Lazar come forward with his story? What could his motivation have possibly been? I mean, he has literally had hundreds of invitations to do interviews on news outlets and to attend UFO conferences. And as I said before, the only one he attended was one where Alejandro had to semi-threaten him to come by reminding him that he signed a contract. And well, there was some other appearance now that I think about it, which was with the little alien. He was doing it as a favor to them, and he probably regrets that. So why did Bob Lazar come forward? Well, the overarching reason he came forward with his story was preservation of life. For starters, working at S4 was an extremely oppressive environment. They embedded tremendous fear surrounding the subject from day one. And they did this through means such as thrusting their fingers into his chest, pointing guns at him, melodic screaming, as well as threats. And frankly, Mr. Lazar put up with it because you're literally working on the most advanced technology on planet Earth that doesn't even originate from planet Earth. So you're really willing to sign those papers and move on with doing something that any scientist would dream of doing. Even beyond all the intimidation tactics used at S4, the security measures and level of compartmentalization were truly obscene and over the top. When Bob Lazar was working at S4, there were only 22 people on the entire planet who knew about the program. They had a literal list of all those names that knew about it, at least officially. Nobody else in the Pentagon, in the Central Intelligence Agency, the NSA would officially know about the program. That's how deep and profound the secrecy was. And the only person that he could discuss and bounce ideas off with when he was working on the project was a man named Barry Castillo, and he was called his buddy. And even at lunch, Bob Lazar could not sit with other people and have small talk with them. Lazar and Barry would always complain about the absence of free discussion, as well as the inability to bring specialists onto the base whenever they would come across problems with the components or something they were working on in reference to the alien technology. But whenever they asked their superiors, hey, we came across a problem, if we could have XYZ specialists, it might help us move forward, they would always scoff at it. The people at S4 that were running this operation put security above just about everything else. So when the circumstance arose that Bob Lazar was no longer getting called back to work at S4, he began to worry about his physical well-being. So what precipitated him not getting called back into work again were events that were taking place in his personal life. You see, when he was being called into work at S4, he'd be called in at all kinds of unusual times. For example, they would call Bob Lazar and say, hey, it's 8:15. We expect you to be at the EG&G building by 9:30, and you might not get back until the following morning. What you have to understand is that sometimes his wife would pick up the phone when his boss was calling him, and when she picked up the phone, his boss would hang up because it wasn't Bob Lazar. That's how over the top the security measures were. But then the boss would call back again, and then Bob Lazar would answer the phone, and then only then would the boss communicate. And Bob Lazar would have a conversation. So you can only imagine what was going through his wife's mind at the time. And this is what started getting her to believe that Mr. Lazar was having an affair when, of course, nothing could be further from the truth. All the while, Bob is really busy going back and forth to S4, working on back engineering the propulsion system of an alien spacecraft, and his wife has nothing to do. She doesn't have a job, and she's feeling neglected. And Bob Lazar has a job, and he's making money, so he decided to pay for flying lessons for his wife. So his wife begins taking flying lessons, and bear in mind, she believes at the time that Bob Lazar is in the midst of an affair. So she begins to have an affair with her flight instructor. And this is when things started to go south, because one of the agreements that Bob Lazar had to make to engage the project at S4 was to have his phone lines tapped 24 hours a day. So the security people who are listening to his phone are witnessing an affair progress between his wife and the flight instructor. And one of the things that these security people are concerned about is not just talking with foreign governments, but also mental stability. So when they begin to see that, oh my God, eventually Mr. Lazar is going to find out his wife is having an affair, they're like, what do we do? Do we just continue to monitor it and see if it fizzles out? They were in a quandary. And they felt like they couldn't continue to trust Mr. Lazar with the biggest secrets the United States government has when he's on the brink of discovering that his wife is having an affair, because this would cause tremendous mental instability within Bob Lazar. So because of that, they literally just stopped calling him in to work at S4. So let's put this in perspective. He has been working on the most secretive project within the U.S. government apparatus, within the United States military, bar none. The people at S4 are obsessed with secrecy. It's so over the top. They want to know where he is 24 hours a day. They instilled fear from day one when he started working at the installation, constantly reminding him that he's under a security oath, threatening him, pushing their fingers into him, engaging in melodic screaming towards him. Just a very unpleasant environment. And suddenly, they're not calling him back into work. He calls his boss, named Dennis. Dennis is not returning his phone call. So very justifiably, Mr. Lazar is starting to say, what the hell is going on here? And he's wondering if he's just going to suddenly disappear. I mean, how could they trust him to continue just move on with your life? You know that the United States government has alien spacecraft and is working on it in secrecy. You've actually been in one of those alien spacecraft. You've been studying the propulsion system, but we're just not going to call you in anymore, and you can move on with your life. Nah, that's not what was going through Mr. Lazar's mind. Before we move any further with the Bob Lazar story, I want to ask you something, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. If you were to fabricate a story and you were to maintain absolute consistency with this story, never adding more to it than you did the day you told it for 30 years, what are the odds that you would inject into this fanciful story that your wife had an affair with a flight instructor? I don't know about you, but if I'm making up a story, about me, I'm not going to inject into it that my wife was having hot sex with her flight instructor. Indeed, I believe this detail of Bob Lazar's story gives credibility to it to some extent. Because if you were to make something up, that's not the most appealing thing to include in your fanciful story. So Bob's not getting called back to work at S4. He calls Dennis. Dennis doesn't return his calls, and he's starting to get very concerned and paranoid, justifiably, that he might just end up disappearing and being erased. And so this is what triggers him to start talking to some of his friends. He begins telling his friend Gene Huff, and he starts telling John Lear. He starts telling his wife, which he was never supposed to do according to the security agreement. He starts telling people about working at S4 on flying saucers. This escalates to where now he's starting to take people out to visual proximity of Papoose Lake, where there are test flights. And he knows the exact time and the exact location of these test flights because he was told them while he was working there. So he takes 3 different groups. Some of the people were the same from group to group, but ultimately there were different groups of people each time. And they all witness something that does not appear to be conventional at all. And he knew the exact time and the exact place that was going to occur. How did Bob Lazar have this kind of data if he has no connection to what was going on? Furthermore, it's necessary to emphasize that this was happening 15 to 17 miles south of Area 51, at a place where nobody even knew it existed. It wasn't in newspapers that S4 existed. It wasn't in the public domain that there was some sort of sub-base at Papoose Lake. Without question, this helps establish the credibility of his story. Now, I did come across an interesting rebuttal, and this probably makes me a very poor attorney, but I'm going to share it with you anyways. UFO Joe 11 writes, during his interview on Richard Dolan's show, Jeremy Corbell said that the video of the 3 test flights over Papoose Lake were of something that looks exactly like a flying saucer. I've watched the videos and little can be deciphered from that nighttime footage. Am I wrong? Jeremy Corbell responds, meaning that all the direct witnesses, some of whom dislike each other very much now, all agree on only one thing from that experience, that what they filmed or saw looked exactly like a flying saucer that maneuvered unlike anything conceivable with even advanced aviation. Okay, so let's say what was witnessed within visual proximity of S4 by Bob Lazar and the 3 groups he brought with him was not an alien-derived craft, as Bob Lazar claims. Why the hell, then, is Bob Lazar not in an orange jumpsuit right now? I mean, there is just no way that when he was working out at the Area 51 complex and was obviously told when there would be test flights and where, that was not something that he was not permitted to reveal. There's no way his NDA did not incorporate something as significant as that. I mean, just think of how much a foreign government would love to get their hands on video footage of top secret military aircraft, and yet no prosecution from the United States whatsoever. If I was part of a governmental structure and I was part of a country and I found out that someone breached their non-disclosure agreement, their oath of secrecy, and they told friends about when a test flight of something secretive was going to take place, and it escalated to the point that it was being recorded from a video camera, I would prosecute them in a split second because that's a huge breach of national security. But Bob Lazar, he wasn't touched. He wasn't prosecuted. That makes absolutely 0 sense no matter how you slice it. I'm going to tell you right now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the reason my client Bob Lazar was not prosecuted was simply because they knew that would make things worse. If it was just a experimental craft, they'll prosecute the living daylights out of him, but they knew it wasn't. This was well beyond an experimental craft. This is revolving around a secret base at Papoose Lake, studying alien spacecraft. You start prosecuting Bob Lazar for breaching his oath of secrecy, he is going to talk to the media. His friends likewise are going to talk to the media while Bob Lazar is being prosecuted. It wouldn't be a pretty sight. And that is the only damn reason the United States government did not prosecute my client for breaching his NDA. The court is in recess. See you all in a couple days. The continuation of this trial will commence in a couple days. So if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a beautiful time to do so. Because I am going to open a can of whoop ass on the prosecution, the likes of which you can't even imagine when the time comes. If you'd like to support this channel, you can check out the t-shirt shop. Link is in the description. Or you could even become a patron. Or you could just slap a like on this bad boy, and I'll appreciate it so much. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.